Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
So, this is an episode with a difference. As we draw to the end of another dramatic year in global politics and governance, academic year that is, I thought it would be fun to sit down with some of my students from this year's cohort on the MSc in Global Governance and Ethics at University College London to discuss how they found the year, their experience studying global governance in these momentous times, their hopes, their aspirations for the future, and, well, what has global governance got to do with it all? This conversation is really testament to why I find teaching global governance to be such a privilege and a challenge, but a challenge that I hugely enjoy in the company of such thoughtful and intrepid fellow travellers.
Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be addressed, and there are a lot of big macro issues that need to be fixed. But I guess doing the global governance course gives you some footing and gives you some confidence that actually you can contribute to those lofty ambitions. And that is, in a sense, exciting.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust Global Governance Futures. In this episode, I am joined by Olivia Crosby, Rachel Dodimead, and Oliver Parker, all current students on the MSc in Global Governance and Ethics in the Department of Political Science at University College London. We spoke in July 2024. So where are we? We're in July, and teaching has formally ended, and now you're all independent researchers working hard on your magnus opus, the dissertation project, after probably a pretty intense year would be my guess. A lot happens in the MSc, a lot happens, it's quite compressed time frame, a lot, time flies when you're having fun, right? So I thought it might be good to pause now and take stock perhaps of where we are and how we got here. And obviously it's been my pleasure to teach you over the last year, both the global governance module, but also various activities outside the classroom, including the trip to Geneva and all of the great events that the Global Governance and Ethics Student Society organized. I've learned a lot in the process, indeed learned a lot from, I think each of you have played a role there in educating me at various points. And it would be great to hear a little bit about what you've learned, what you take away from this year. So perhaps we'll begin by just going around the room. If you could just introduce yourselves and share a bit about your background. Perhaps we'll begin with Rachel. Thanks, Rachel.
I'm Rachel. My background. What background in terms of what we did before we came, or background of what we've chosen to focus and hone in on in our masters, or both?
Perhaps a little bit of both.
Okay, so I did PPE as my undergraduate, and then I took a gap year, did a bit of traveling, and I think that's definitely why I chose, not because of the traveling, but because of my PPE broad background, why I wanted to choose a very broad subject. I feel like global governance encapsulates so much, and I feel like specifically quite a lot of the issues globally that I'm interested in was something I was really able to focus on within this course and explore further, as opposed to some of the more not narrow, because obviously every master's is gonna give you the scope, but I think that is something unique to global governance. You can look at things at very different angles, which is something that I absolutely loved. And then I'm currently writing my dissertation on climate change and loss and damage and climate justice. So that's definitely something that I'm passionate about. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. I mean, global governance is definitely a many splendid thing. Perhaps we'll return to that in just a minute.
Yeah.
Let's hear from Ollie.
Ollie, I've got a background in political theory at Exeter Uni, and I chose global governance and ethics because I like the philosophy stuff is great, and I still love it, but it doesn't necessarily leave you thinking that you've got a clear sense of where your interest in politics can take you, like professionally or just generally what the next steps could be. And so when I was looking for a course that might give me a bit more structure and clarity in terms of what I wanted to do with my interests, global governance and ethics, it kind of fused the normativity that I enjoyed in philosophy and political theory with something that felt a bit more not only concrete but like forward thinking, and had like sort of like a forward trajectory. It's like looking at things that are going to matter in the future rather than maybe reflecting on how things have looked in the past, which is still useful. But yeah, that was why I was attracted to it. And I would say that my focus has sort of similar to what Rachel said in terms of it being quite broad and all encompassing the course. I would say my focus has been quite like macro. So I'm writing my dissertation about how globalization sort of creates tensions with democracy. And that's an issue that you see like across Europe. So it's not something that's maybe specific to like a certain country and so forth. And so I've enjoyed, yeah, looking at those like overarching themes that are prescient at the moment.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think I should also just do a shout out for the podcast here, which
Yeah.
Ollie has
Yeah,
guested
my God,
on as
yeah.
co-host, which has been fantastic. And it's been really fun exploring some of that macro territory, sometimes pretty off the reservation territory in that context as well. But also, as you say, trying to bring it back to reality, bring it down to the ground. Sort of what is the relevance here of that normative debate for thinking through practical directions of travel when it comes to actual politics, governance. Yeah, thanks, Ollie. And last but certainly not least, Lib.
Yeah, I'm Liv. I did my undergraduate degree in economics at Bristol University. And I actually, on the whole, didn't enjoy it that much. I always gravitated more towards the kind of human rights side of it. So anything that related to economic inequality, I was interested in, or specifically women's rights. And I knew I wanted to do a master's, and I was sure it was going to be in political science, maybe public policy, maybe social policy. My friend actually sent me this course, and she was like, "This is right up your street." And initially, I'm not embarrassed to say, initially, I actually misunderstood what global governance was. I thought it was about learning about different governing structures. I'd never heard of global governance before, so I was kind of like, "Oh, this is new." And then I realized that it's not too dissimilar from international relations, which I quite liked. But I think what attracted me to it is that it's applicable to kind of everything. I mean, the fact you have sort of like global governance of AI, I mean, I find that so interesting. I think we definitely need something that's new and adaptable in this sort of ever-changing world. And another big thing for me was the fact that I could actually study women. I mean, I'm doing my dissertation now on women's rights. That was a sort of priority for me. I wanted to make sure that that was something I could specialize in. But what global governance allowed me to do is to look at that on a global scale, which is really important. I knew I wanted to do important work, and I would always say I want to help people. I don't really know how, but not nationally. I wanted it to be like on the biggest scale possible. So global governance kind of ticked all the boxes. So yeah.
Might be a good time to discuss a little bit, well, what is global governance? And obviously, having taught the program for 10 years now, I spent a lot of time trying to answer that question. And hopefully, I do a fairly good job in the first lecture of the module. But as Liv says, it is operating at that high scale, macro, global scale. But a big part of the challenge is how do we articulate that global scale down to the regional, down to the local? How do we understand multi-level governance? How do we understand the footprint of global governance? How do we understand the impact of global governance on the supposed beneficiaries, although sometimes victims of global governance? And it's been really fun designing the course. And as you say, we do global governance of new technology and artificial intelligence. We do global governance of health. We do it on climate change. We do it on human rights. we do it on global economy. So it's kind of a patchwork of different empirical domains to try and grapple with, okay, we have this theory, we have a kind of theoretical apparatus about how global governance works or should work in the world, but how does it actually play out in practice across these different thematic areas? But of course, also, you're all exploring your own individual interests as well within that kind of umbrella. And I guess the question for you would be, and Liv has partly answered it already, but what was your understanding of global governance before you joined the course, and what was it that motivated you to choose this particular program? Should we start with Ollie this time, perhaps?
Sure,
That's
sure.
okay.
I think that my understanding of global governance prior to coming into the course was that it was a lot more efficient than what it
Yeah.
actually is, to be honest with you. Like I sort of had I guess visions of like how the UN operated and how lots of other international organizations worked relative to member states and like countries, and just assumed that the sort of grandiose nature of the mandate and the remit meant that they got things done and meant that it was effective. And obviously to an extent it is. But so I think what the course does well is explore like the nuances and the complexities as you're describing, like moving from that macro level down into the regional, and even to the local. And I think maybe to sum it up in like a sentence, I've come to understand global governance as a form of like crisis management, essentially. So that there's like issues that you can't, the issues that are inherently transnational, like climate change or evolving AI or ungoverned AI, critical mineral supply chains, things like this that are inherently across the borders. And you do just need international cooperation to try and address those challenges. And I think the course breaks that up quite nicely, because I sort of understood it as there being different types of issues that require different types of governance, and what sense of the structures are currently well equipped to dealing with these issues and which ones are maybe a little less well equipped. Yeah, I hope that's answered some of the question.
Yeah, I mean, let me sort of flesh that out a little more then. I mean, in the part of the course, certainly where we begin, which is quite perhaps it's quite sort of front loaded with quite big concepts and ideas, and we do power, right? And we
Yeah.
look at not only levels, which is kind of the architecture of global governance, but we look at the power distribution among different actors, and that's
Yeah.
not just states, right? That's also private corporations, it's NGOs, it's all sorts of other transnational networked actors that are operating sometimes across levels, sometimes within the state, sometimes sort of beyond the state. So we're trying to grapple with that, and not only kind of where that works in a kind of a efficiency functional sense, but also perhaps the pathologies of where power intrudes and undermines what might be a functional global governance response to a crisis or a problem. And I think it's interesting, your reflection, Ollie, because I guess if we could all just get into a time machine and go back to 1995, we might all, many of us would probably sit there and maybe agree that, this is a very functional global governance system, sort of at that moment. So kind of the liberal triumph post-Cold War, Fukuyama, the end of history. But it's almost 30 years later, right? And we're having to kind of update our models and trying to make sense of what our current reality looks like. Yeah. Rachel, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, I was right on the back of what Ollie said. I think going on, how we had this perception of like the UN, it's so great. Like, I'm not saying it's not great, but I think it was quite, when we went to Geneva and we went to the UN and they said they can't even afford their electricity bill. I think that was a real moment where it's like, yeah, okay, we do have this huge, powerful organization, but like even within that, they have their own issues like on that whole global governance scale. But I think for me, it's so interesting you ask this question, because it's the first question everyone asks when you say, oh, what masters do you do in global governance? They go, oh, wow. And then they're like, what is that? And I'm kind of like, what is it? Great question. Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's so many things into one, which I think is why it's so complicated to explain. But I think the easiest way to take it is exactly what Ollie said. Like if you think of the issues which you can't just narrow down to one place, like something that's not necessarily just happening in like your local area, and then almost like work backwards from that. And then within that broader issue, you've got all those issues of like power and order, you've got inequality, you've got the whole issue of how the system was set up like 50 years ago and how that plays in like the modern day, and that has a massive issue and interplay on the global governance structure of how we deal with those issues today. So I feel like that's how I like think to try and explain it, but it is a difficult one because it is almost so much complexity into one. But that, again, what I love about it is I feel like it is forward thinking. Like, yeah, you have to know the background and some of like the theoretical concepts, but predominantly is like what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future. And I think that's something that definitely caught my attention when looking at the course, because I'm not here to study history. Like, if I wanted to study like those really long issues past, I would have done something like that, something really political, theoretical. But I think I get really drawn into what's here, what's right now, like what can we actually do to like make changes and make improvements. And that is something that I think this course really grasps and like allows you to explore more. So yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me a bit of something Daniel Schmachtenberger said on the podcast. He said, you often hear this slogan, think global, act local.
Mm-hmm.
But in practice, what a lot of us are doing is actually thinking local and acting locally. So to try and make visible what are the kind of indirect consequences of local actions for the globality, whether it's climate change or whatever else we're looking at. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Liv.
I'm going to try not to repeat what both Ollie and Rachel said because I agree completely. I think it's very much the same thing. I think there's definitely a trend of global governance kind of being what you want it to be. That's kind of what I've taken from it, because I think I was having this conversation with another course mate actually, and my interpretation of global governance was different from her interpretation. I found that very interesting because I initially, when I applied to this course, I was like, oh my God, the UN, I'm going to work for UN Women. And it's like global governance, exactly what it is. It's about learning about international organizations. And I was speaking to her and she was like, that's not what I think global governance is. I think global governance is kind of like a multilateral cooperation on not unilateral, but maybe individual issues or multifaceted issues. So it's kind of like this global effort to deal with these very complex challenges. And as I've learned more about global governance, I would say that is probably my opinion about what it is as well now, I think. But yeah, I mean, I find it I really like the fact that it's always changing and it can be anything. I like the fact that it's adaptable and it can be what you want it to be, because I find other schools of thought or other sort of like courses to be a little bit too stale. And if you're not allowed to change your opinion of it and how you'd apply it, then how can you apply it to a world that's constantly changing? That's kind of how I view it.
So I guess perhaps just to develop that a little more, and maybe you could bring in some concrete examples, but how do you feel the program, the subject matter has met or exceeded or differed from your expectations, or indeed whether there's been anything you were like, oh, that's been a real surprise, actually? I mean, has it filled in any gaps in your knowledge? Or
I mean, it's definitely filled in many, many gaps in my knowledge. When I think back to September when I first started, I really don't think I had much of a clue about actually what global governance was. I mean, I think I knew that it was like, we learn a lot about international organizations and learn about kind of how they do really good work and how they work, but also the negative. So I really have enjoyed that we're able to critique kind of an international organization fundamentally about how is it possible that we can vote on certain policies and then implement them in different countries. I find that very interesting. So I suppose sort of a conversation on sovereignty. And I think what surprised me, like I keep saying, I think it's honestly how you can pretty much, if it's a global issue, you can pretty much discuss it within global governance. And I think when we had our assessment period at the end of term 2, we had so many essays, and I really didn't want to discuss anything that I kind of knew about already in the assessments. I wanted to approach new things and things that have always I found really interesting, or things that'd be interesting to read. And so I wanted to kind of play on the flexibility that global governance has to do that. So I think that has been a surprise, because to me, education has always been right or wrong, I mean, what somebody who was in the same class as me 10 years ago would have learned the same thing I'm learning. And I find that a little bit stale, just a little bit same thing, same old, same old. So yeah, that's been quite surprising to me, I think.
Perhaps speaks to the more high-level rarefied claim people like Zach Stein make, which is all global problems are ultimately problems of education. And, I think that's also come up time and again in various conversations, is we inherit all of the legacy ideas and structures and paradigms and everything else. So, we need to be critical about the extent to which they're a good fit to the world, the challenges that we currently face. And so, I mean, in many ways, this is an experiment in innovation with all of you in the course and program as well, right?
Yeah. I also think that from my side, when you're like in the weeds of reading literature and even just trying to like plug into the news and get a sense for what global governance is, but also what the important issues are that global governance structures are trying to address, you can sort of forget, or you can sort of overlook how much you're actually learning. So just like identifying, for example, like the issues to do with ungoverned AI or supply chains is something that I never really thought about, like EV batteries, right? Which are things that are like super important to most people's day-to-day lives into like an energy transition, which is an important issue for global governance structures to try and get on top of. And you can start like, I definitely didn't even realize that I was like revealing how important that issue was to myself while I was coming across it, because you just have that, you read it, and then there's like another reading, and then there's another reading, and all these things like pile on top of each other. But when you stop to reflect on it and you think about the things that you've actually taken away over the last year, just like getting a lay of the land and just like knowing like what the important issues are for the next 30 years is super helpful. And I think the course does a good job at steering you in that direction. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Definitely. It's been good for me, like looking at what I want to do after my degree and just identifying like, okay, if I know I'm not like super passionate about any one given thing to begin with, what are the topics that are clearly really important, like the energy transition, or like, I know I've said critical minerals loads, but it's a thing that I've become quite interested in. The failures of globalization and wealth inequality between the haves and the have-nots, stuff like that.
So yeah, I mean, basically, when you're sort of reading the media, The Economist, whatever you read,
Yeah,
you feel like you can now kind of have more insight into the matrix, if you will.
100%.
You
There's like a
get
clear
started.
criteria. You know what I mean? Like when I'm looking at articles, they sort of prior to the course, they maybe felt a bit disparate and disjointed. And they was just like, oh, this is to do with tech. And like I didn't do a degree in like engineering, so what does it mean to me? It's not directly relevant. But when you do global governance and when you learn about how the things all thread together a little more, and especially like what the geopolitical risks associated with a lot of other sectors are, that you can start to this is again like my own personal opinion, you can start to understand what you might want to do with an interest in politics beyond like generic pipe dreams about being a diplomat or like working in the foreign office, which are still great things. And like I'd still love to do stuff like that. But you know what I mean? You can like flesh it out a little more because you understand how it fits into other sectors.
I think generic pipe dreams might be a good title for this episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds very exciting, the way you laid that out, Ollie.
Yeah, no, I mean that's how I've reflected on it, definitely. Like if I'm thinking about what I've taken away from the course and like how it's helped what I'm doing now, that's definitely it. Just like being attuned to things that seem to be important for the foreseeable future.
No, I would agree with Ollie. I think it's more, whereas before this course, I'd probably taken one issue and looked at that one issue, and then it would then, you wouldn't look at how everything is interconnected. But now I feel like it's hard to do global governance and look at one single thing through one lens. You kind of have to think, yeah, that's connected to that and that and that. So it's like all one piece of a massive jigsaw puzzle. And I think that's something definitely that I've learned massively, specifically on that like multilateral geopolitical scale. Like it's like a domino effect, and everything will impact everything else, which is quite scary as well. And I would say I have a little less hope for the future than I did before this course, but I think that's just a sign of the current political times and and everything that's going on around us in the world. But it's been a massive learning curve for sure.
I definitely agree. I think also one thing I'd say, what Ollie mentioned about the articles is so true, because I feel like when I was doing my undergrad, I would always shy away from anything that was, I mean, I'd understand kind of things about economics, but if it wasn't about that, I would just sort of shy away from it. And I'd be like, oh, I don't really understand. I don't have the knowledge to actually understand what's in this article. So what's the point in reading it? And I think doing global governance has really allowed me to think critically about things that I might not have expertise in, but I have the skills to kind of know how certain things might fit in with this global kind of jigsaw puzzle, as you say, which is quite empowering actually, because I feel like it's given me a lot more confidence in like so many different areas.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big motivation in the course, is to not treat these different issues as silos, which is actually also an analytical challenge, right? A lot of scholarship is very siloed into, trade or human rights or climate change or health. But of course, actually, when you get into the weeds, you realize there's a lot of interfacing, a lot of interaction across those domains. If you don't understand the trade domain, then you're not going to really be able to make sense of why we're stuck when it comes to climate governance, because obviously the trade domain is crucial in terms of understanding the externalities surrounding the global economy and its impacts on climate change. So yeah, hopefully we managed to convey that to you all.
No, and I also think the ethics aspect also really neatly tied it together as well, but obviously from like a different perspective. Like I feel like in that course it was, again, you looked at multiple like different issues and the interconnections within them, but like on the normative side. And I think that also for me added like I loved that, looking at it. Yeah, they have the same or similar normative themes running through, and that's another way to connect like the complexity between all these different issues, which was really interesting.
Right, and you're doing this fascinating dissertation right now on loss and damage within the climate change regime. And that's just a really concrete way to actually grapple with questions of justice within that context. And it makes those normative concerns, which obviously, have decades, centuries of scholarship underlying these concerns, it makes them very real and alive and contemporary within what can, from the outside, look like quite a bureaucratic, committee-dominated arena.
Yeah, I think it's helpful as well because like you can sort of it's similar to the dissertation I'm doing. I think just listening to the reflection on Rachel's, mine's actually quite normative as well, talking about the sort of damages of financialization, essentially. But I think the point I wanted to make is that you can sort of couch normative arguments in a lot of objective analysis, which is like really helpful because especially from my background doing philosophy, you can sort of get lost in just making points because you know that they're right or because they sound like they're morally correct. But that only takes you like so far in terms of actually cutting through and sounding coherent and making credible arguments, because a lot of what you say still has to be rooted in like objective fact and proper analysis. And yeah, that's really helpful too.
Rachel, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree with that. Like I definitely, from doing philosophy at undergrad, I completely agree. There is only so much. I don't want to downplay philosophy. Like there is only so much you can do with that kind of deep theoretical, like moral normative kind of framework thinking. Like I think you do need that kind of analytical, like objective in the real world like approach as well, which is why I think the merger of the two is kind of like the perfect mix. But yeah, I agree with Ollie.
So perhaps we'll just shift focus a little bit and move to the more day-to-day experience. So it'll be wonderful if you could share a little bit about how you found the experience of studying both as a cohort within the Global Governance and Ethics program and perhaps more broadly at UCL or living in London. I don't know who wants to kick us off.
Yeah, I don't mind kicking off. I mean, I feel like I've said this to so many people. I think the global governance and ethics cohort is probably the nicest group of people I've ever met in education. I feel like I've had such fantastic conversations with people inside and outside the classroom. I feel like it's so sort of liberating to hear different perspectives. And I think because everyone's from slightly different backgrounds, you really do hear interesting things. I mean, there's people on a course who've done engineering, there's people who have done all sorts. So it's like you have people from different walks of life, which I think is really interesting. And also I think it can be very intimidating. I was really intimidated to join our course purely because I felt like everyone's going to know what they're talking about. And, I'm the youngest I could be to be doing a master's, let alone coming from a completely different background. So I was quite worried about it. But I've never felt judged or even when we did our presentations, I was like, even if I mess up, it's not a problem. Everyone's so kind, which is really, really important, I think. And in terms of UCL, I mean, it's like the most beautiful campus ever. And it's just like so well located. I've really, really enjoyed my time at UCL. I've had a few people message me who are considering doing masters there. And I'm always like, it's really the best place to do it. Yeah.
It is nice having an actual campus in London. It's not always the case. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. Rachel?
I would agree on our cohort that we have been so unbelievably lucky with our cohort. Like it as like a group of people, I feel like we're all friends. Like everyone is so supportive, which is quite nice. Like read each other's essays and stuff, which also you learn so much from as well. But like everyone's just so nice, which definitely helps. But I think we're all quite similar minded, which is probably why we kind of all get on. So I think that isn't probably something that's unique just to our cohort, but probably would happen in every cohort that does global governance. One thing I would say, coming in and being thrown into the quant module, pure coding, was a bit of a shock to the system. I can't lie to you. I think I was not expecting. I don't know, wasn't quite expecting that. And I think term one, like week one, and you're hit with we're doing hard coding, and you're kind of like, whoa, this is not what I signed up for. But like ultimately, as a reflection, you learned so much from that. Like definitely something out of my comfort zone, but did good skill to have, definitely. And you do use it, like it's very good to have on your CV as well. But that's definitely something I wasn't expecting. But also good, like completely agree with what Liv's saying, like the teaching staff as well, so friendly at UCL. Like I don't know whether it's just a difference at masters compared to undergrad, but I was so shocked at the difference of like the almost like the connection and like the relationship you have with your lecturers. It's much more, I don't know, it's just different. Like I feel like it's more interpersonal, like you have more deep conversations, like inside and outside the classroom as well, and everyone is just more willing to help. I don't know, that's my reflection of it. It just seems a lot more engaging is what I would say. But I think that's also a reflection on UCL. Like it's a fantastic uni and also a beautiful campus.
Definitely unique to UCL, yes.
Yeah.
We're the friendliest. Thanks, Rachel. Ollie?
I would just echo. I think Rachel and Liv have like perfectly summarized everything that's great about being at UCL. I'd only add that I love Senate House Library and I just love studying there. That's like the only other thing. Like all the interpersonal stuff, everything that you said, I think is bang on. Plus, some of the library spaces are just gorgeous. So that's really nice,
Yeah, and it's cool to hang out in the location where Batman was shot, right? Which I think is Senate House.
Yeah, and it inspired the Ministry of Truth in 1984, I think, as well. So that's a bit oxymoronic in terms of me loving it, but
Brilliant. So, well, here we are. You're still in the program, still working away hard on your dissertations, but I guess we're moving into a little bit of a transition time as you begin to move towards trying to find your feet professionally. So I was curious to ask, how do you feel the program has informed your career aspirations? I mean, what kinds of roles or fields are you interested in pursuing after graduation? Who wants to jump in?
I can
Ollie?
jump
Oh,
in.
sorry.
Yeah,
You
thanks.
go, Ollie.
Oh, okay. Okay. I would say that touching on what I mentioned earlier about identifying which issues are going to be important for the foreseeable future has been really helpful for me because I'm not someone that's had like a specific passion growing up. So I've not, when you're young and you get advice that's like, oh, just follow your passion, like do the thing that you love, and that will guide you into like a good day-to-day working lifestyle. I've not always been able to identify like clearly the thing that I find that I'm passionate about. So having an opportunity to really flesh out the issues or the problems that like really deserve attention has been really useful in terms of guiding me towards different sectors or like different sort of topics. I know I've mentioned it multiple times, but like things to do with the energy transition and like critical minerals has surfaced in recent months as something that I find very interesting. And that's at the sort of juncture of the work that I've done um, at UCL and then like some of the work that I'm doing now, that it's sort of married together perfectly. Like UCL, I think the global governance course really opened my mind up to the sort of supply chain element to it and the sort of power relations and like China sort of gatekeeping a lot of the access to minerals for sort of geopolitical reasons. And yeah, like the first module, I think addresses those dynamics in a quite an interesting way. And then I've been able to build on that, like in terms of the work that I'm doing. And it has been a lot more seamless. It's not been seamless, but it's been a lot more connected than I thought. And a lot of that probably just comes down to luck and just like falling into interesting places. But it's nice to know that you can like 100% take things out of the course, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is, in a sense, horizon scanning as well, right? Getting some sense of what are the trends, processes that are in motion, and looking out there ahead to 2030, 2040, which obviously is when you guys are going to be hitting your stride, in whatever profession you choose. It's going to be very exciting to see where you do land. Obviously, I hope we'll stay in touch and I'll be getting you in to give guest talks at UCL. So yeah, great. Thanks, Ollie. Liv?
Yeah, so when I initially, like I said, when I started this course, I really thought I wanted to work within the UN, specifically UN Women. That was kind of my goal. And actually, I think throughout the year, I've had this subtle nudge continuously going, sort of pushing me into law. And I come from a family of lawyers, and I've been like, I'm not going to go down that path. I want to make my own path. I was very determined not to do the law thing. But actually, I realized I did my first presentation on rule of law, international rule of law. And I remember thinking it's going to be so stale. And I like, and actually I really, really enjoyed it. And that was sort of when I thought, okay, maybe law could suit me. And Geneva is what really did it for me because it was when we went to the UN. I was inspired, but I also felt like this isn't really for me. I kind of realized that I didn't really want to work in that sort of setting. And our networking event was incredible because I spoke to so many different amazing people, and every single person I spoke to had done law at some point in their life. And I was kind of like, okay, I really think this is something I need to consider seriously. And for the last 3-4 months, alongside my degree, I've been volunteering for our national domestic abuse helpline, where I give very basic legal advice, which pairs really well with the dissertation I'm doing. And I also think that my experience at UCL has been so positive that it has kind of changed my view of education slightly. I think I came in knowing I wanted to do a master's, but I was very much like, kind of let's get it over and done with. My degree was really, really tough, and I really just gritted my teeth and got through it. So this master's has been so pleasant. Even the exam period, honestly, I found really enjoyable at times. And it's kind of inspired me to continue education and do a law conversion course, which I'm considering at the moment, which would start in January, which would also be in Bloomsbury. So
That's exciting, Liv. That's great. And I'm glad to hear the examination period actually quite enjoyable at the moment. Always nice to hear. We have another former alumni, Sam Coleman, who also occasionally co-hosts on the podcast, who did a law conversion course as well, and is currently a trainee solicitor. So, yeah, maybe if you'd like to have a chat with him some point, we can arrange that.
yeah, I should do. Yeah.
So Rachel,
Yeah.
your
Well,
thoughts?
very changed my mind quite often, but I think end goal, I think I'm still on the UNDP, UNFCCC, UNAID, something like that. I just really, that is like pipe dream. But I think potentially, when I started the course, I thought I want to do it straight away. Whereas I feel like now I've kind of feel like that's where I want to end up, but I don't know when I want to be there or like anything. You know, so I think it's got a less vague, which I think is good and interesting. But for now, I'm excited, which I feel like is strange because I feel like before the future really stressed me out. You know, I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And people would ask me, they're like, it was a really stressful thing. Whereas now I'm just actually genuinely like excited. Like there's so many things you can do. There's so many options and like open doors and stuff. And I have some, you know, whether that's like ESG, corporate social responsibility. Like I'm working with a charity next year for the year, which I'm super excited about. I think, yeah, so that's kind of my thought process, which is very incoherent, which I do apologize. But I think at the beginning of this year, I got a grad scheme as a banker for Lloyds Bank. And I just think that was a real turning point for me of like, not for me. I do not want to, whether it's maybe me in 10 years time, I don't know, but I was just kind of, and everyone was around me being like, Rachel, that's just not you. Like, that's just not the type of person like you are to go into that kind of like really heavily finance, like corporate sector and stuff. And I think kind of shifted. I was like, yeah, definitely want to go more on the humanitarian kind of side. So sorry, that's very unhelpful, but that is my kind of thinking along this process.
No, yeah. I think that's very helpful. And, you know, I think another aspect to doing a master's, which is often perhaps not so well understood, is that it does give you some time, you know, to metabolize, to process after your undergraduate, perhaps after a bit of traveling too in some cases, or perhaps after some professional experience. But, you know, I think a lot of students come into the program and through the course of the year tend to reorientate or to establish a bit more of a direction as to where their real interests lie. And that's obviously, you know, a wonderful part of having that time to reflect.
No, for sure, definitely.
So you also said, Rachel, that you used to be pretty stressed out about the future. And, you know, there is a sort of a sense around that the future is kind of stressful.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ethos sort of underpinning this course that's important to me is to try and, you know, without necessarily being overly optimistic, to actually really try and set out the dynamic context within which we find ourselves, and to provide a sort of pragmatic but realistic sense of optimism about, well, there are all of these latent potentials and possibilities. In a sense, it's informed also by my reading of, say, critical scholarship. So Mark Fisher's work, you know, his famous phrase, "The future is cancelled," as a kind of a zeitgeist within the culture. And I personally think it's quite important to resist that notion, because the future is never cancelled, right? History shows that. So I suppose as we sort of roll to a close, I'd be curious to ask, you know, what are your sort of hopes for the future? I mean, in terms of global governance, in terms perhaps of ethical leadership, where do you land at the moment on those sorts of questions?
I think.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think for me, my idea of what I want to do in the future and sort of the work I want to do has changed so much, because actually, very similar to Ollie, you know, I was always told, follow your passion. And I remember it was this looming anxiety literally throughout GCSEs and A levels of, oh my God, what am I going to do? At one point, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. At one point, I wanted to be a vet. It was just like, you have to choose something and go into it, and that's it. And you're going to be in it for life. And I think I've definitely shifted my idea from, you know, what am I passionate about? Because my passions aren't really, I'd say, to do with the things I study. My passions are more like, you know, singing or things like that. But what I care about is what I think drives my aspirations in terms of career. Because I think my goal is to always work on things that I care about, because I really do care about helping people and making a difference. So I know that if I'm doing that, I'm kind of always on the right road. And I also think, you know, this master's made me realize, especially the networking event, it's made me realize that actually, if you do the things that you enjoy, the things you care about, you're always gonna kind of do your best work. And then you can always go and work for like international organizations as you get older, like later in your career. That's something I definitely realized. I kind of thought you had to do internships there and then work your way up, but that's definitely not how most people get into it. So yeah, I'd say my goals have definitely changed. Yeah.
And your hopes for the future, Liv, in terms of the big macro picture?
My hopes for the
things on
future.
that.
Well, honestly, I think I'm slightly delusional in that my genuine goal for the future is to like is to prove globally that restrictive abortion laws are really detrimental to women. That would be my like life goal. Although obviously that is a very complex issue that I don't think one person can solve, but I'm trying to with my dissertation. So yeah, that is my life goal. Yeah, slightly delusional perhaps.
Well, I'm sure you're going to find lots of like-minded allies and coalitions along the way.
Absolutely, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you. Ollie?
It's hard. I mean, I definitely don't have a clear sense as Liv's just described of like what I want to do. Um, but that sounds great, by the way, Liv. That sounds like a great plan for sure. I think I'm still like figuring it out. Like I say, I'm sort of just following the um the issues that seem prescient. I'm not necessarily like I don't have a sense of what I think is like immediately important at my sort of like core, and I'm going to sort of follow that. It's more like what is happening externally and seems to be a driving factor in terms of like how we go about doing better things, like transitioning away from awful fossil fuels, or I guess the abortion thing is another good example. But just like finding out where those spaces are and like what the plans are. Like for example, you know, there's a big question looming over like Britain's future in the world, you know, like post Brexit, there's a bit of an identity crisis going on, and like the country has to recalibrate and figure out what its foreign policy is, like where it stands relative to other countries. And so if I'm trying to be a bit more tangible about, you know, what my sort of like aspirations would be, or like what I think is important, like, you know, helping a country like recalibrate in the right way, which I imagine is going to involve figuring out like how they contribute to the energy transition, sounds really cool and like sounds really interesting. Agreeable disagreement is another thing. If I could get really, now I'm starting to think of stuff. If I could get like big and macro and abstract and vague, I would say like just a sort of general climate politically in which people were more open to the agreeable disagreement, so that you didn't have things that were so polarized, because that's obviously a huge problem, like in Europe and in the US at the moment. You know, France and Le Pen, and Trump's probably going to come the president, and reform are getting a popular vote, and all these different things are happening like literally right now. And yeah, those things, I don't know, I think I'm rambling, to be honest with you, because I don't have a very coherent answer, but these are things that I think are important and that I think we ought to be striving toward making better. Yeah.
Vote for Ollie.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that again, that's really integral to the course, in that this is real politics, right? These are moments of real historical choice where decisions really matter. So, you know, ideally that should be empowering, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that goes back to a point that Rachel made earlier about, actually being, in a sense, excited. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be addressed, and there are a lot of big macro issues that need to be fixed. But I guess doing the global governance course gives you some footing and gives you some confidence that actually you can contribute to those lofty ambitions. And that is, in a sense, exciting, even though you'd think, well, these are bad things and you ought not to be excited about these bad things. The prospect of being able to contribute to fixing them is a really empowering thing. So yeah.
Rachel.
Gosh. I would say I feel like I'm in between Ollie and Liv, whereas I have some very clear like things I'm so passionate about, but they're also set in such different directions. So it's kind of like where I end up, who knows? But on like a more like local, not local, but like national level, like prison reform is something I'm really interested in. And I feel like that has been a passion of mine literally for like 6 or 7 years. But whether that's anything I'll actually tap into, who knows? We'll see in the future. But then like also I feel like at the core of my heart is like poverty, impact, climate change impact on poverty. I would say like if we're talking like at the moment currently, I would say that's like my direction of like the kind of area I want to be working within. But I don't know, in that sense, I'm kind of skeptical. I don't really share. I need to share some more optimism of the future. But like what Ollie said, with the potential of Trump being re-elected, we've got like the percentage of the vote that Reform had last night was quite high, like 14%. With like we've got all of these like really interesting like
I should clarify that this conversation is taking place in the morning after the general election here in the UK, 5th of July.
Yes, yeah. Like I think, and with the elections that are going to happen in France, like it's such an interesting political time. And I think next year's cohort are going to have so much to talk about and like almost see out more how that plays out. But I think you just got to watch the space, really see actually what is going to happen, because I think at this point in time you can't predict at all what we're even going to be in 2 years' time. I think especially on globalization, multilateralism, I think even on things which we were sure about kind of like 5 years ago, I think everything is so uncertain, which I think kind of adds to my whole, you can't really be sure nowadays because you kind of have to move with what's happening in the situation. It kind of doesn't really make sense to be like have one stuck direction, because you just have to be flexible about the changing situations around you. But yeah, again, that's very unhelpful, so I do apologize.
I don't think that's unhelpful. Yeah.
No, that was really helpful.
Yeah, it's a very valuable insight that it's good sometimes to sit with uncertainty, to sit with confusion, to not rush to judgment, to not rush to action, and to be able to do that in good company, all the better.
Exactly. Yeah.
So perhaps we'll close. I'd just like to ask you if you have any final thoughts or reflections you'd like to share about your experience in the program, or perhaps any favorite memories or moments that you'd like to share.
I would say that the trip to Geneva was definitely a highlight. I think definitely in terms of it was a learning experience for me, but also just I feel like our second term we weren't together as much as a whole cohort. So I think it was a really nice way to kind of end the term, and then we will go off and do our independent work. I would also say, I mean, I really don't want to sound like an advert for the course because I feel like that can come across a bit forced, but I would honestly say I think global governance is really well suited to people who perhaps if you're kind of interested in loads of different things, I feel like everyone on our course, it's not like they've got one thing they're like, I have to do this. It's like they've got so many different interests and they're open to kind of learning about them in different ways. I think that's something I've picked up on the course. So I think, yeah, if that resonates with people, then you should definitely consider doing global governance. Yeah.
I'll second that.
No, I agree with Liv on both aspects. Like Geneva was definitely a highlight. Geneva was exhausting, but like in a good way. Like I felt like I needed like a week-long recovery period after Geneva, but it was like so much fun. And it was nice, as you said, to like be all together before we do like all our independent research, and like not everyone is still in London, so it was a really nice like opportunity. And I also agree with what Liv's saying, like if you kind of don't know, or you have lots of interests, it's probably the better way to put it, then, but more on like a macro scale, I would say, like if you're interested but in bigger picture ideas, then global governance is definitely for you.
Yeah, I think that's like the best advice to give, because I think a lot of people probably are in that position, especially people who have like a vague sense of being interested in politics, or I think more broadly just doing the right thing, or like just wanting to put yourself in a position where you can help. That can be a bit daunting, and it can be a bit vague. So a course like global governance, I think does a very good job at like genuinely organizing your thoughts a little bit and saying, well, here's one space where you could be useful and that you could be helpful, and there's an issue that needs addressing, and here's another space. And I think that's really good for just like distilling your thoughts and positioning yourself for whatever you want to do next. And I have to give a shout out to the podcast as well, because we only touched on it a little bit, but that allowed me to continue on with all of the passions that I have for philosophy, and for just like really getting stuck into ideas that you just otherwise don't have time to talk about, like in like the normal curriculum. And also just engaging with like sort of spheres of academia that are just super interesting. Like the episode that we did with Benita Roy, like will always be with me. It was just so fascinating. And she just had such wonderful insights in terms of describing this like strange place that we're in. Like we were talking earlier about like the far right and this sort of period of change, and she has such a sort of beautiful way of describing this period as transitory. And it's just, it's an outlook that I think people should definitely take the time to at least dip their toes into. It is very hard to understand, and I don't get it all entirely. And I spoke to her for like an hour. And what's the name of the cast of characters? I can't remember, Tom, that she's a part of.
The intellectual dark web, is it? Or
It's like a website that group have.
oh yeah, Perspectiva.
Yeah, Perspectiva, that's the website. Yeah. Like a lot of the stuff on there is deep and complex, but also very enriching and very nice if you just want to read something, really, I would say.
I entirely agree. I really love just browsing through that website, and it is quite eclectic material, but it expands my horizons,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings this to a close. Yes, everything is transient, as you say, Ollie, but you have these moments punctuated by authentic, alive connection. And it's really been a pleasure to have this conversation with you all. I've really enjoyed this year. Hopefully it gives people a flavor of the conversations we had through the seminars, and how you kept me all on my toes, which is always appreciated. And I will miss you. I hope you will stay in touch. And, perhaps we'll pick this conversation up again in 5 years. And that'll be exciting.
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
A real pleasure. Lovely to see you all.
And you. We will all, I'm sure, stay in touch.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.